Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Augustus Melu, a manager here at Unicom Seminars. We're pleased to be hosting a webinar this afternoon titled Big DevOps 5 Top Tips When Implementing at Scale. The webinar is presented by Andy Mann, Vice President of Strategic Solutions at CA Technologies. With over 20 years experience across 4 continents, Andy has deep expertise of enterprise software on cloud, mainframe, mid-range, server, and desktop systems. Andy has worked within IT departments for governments and corporations, from small businesses to global multinationals, with several large enterprise software vendors, and as a leading industry analyst advising enterprises, governments, and IT vendors from startups to world's largest companies. Andy has been widely published, including in the New York Times, US Today, CIO, Computer World, Information Week, Tech Target, and more. He has presented across the world on virtualization, cloud, automation, and IT management at events such as Gartner, IT Expo, VMworld, CA World, Interop, Cloud Computing Expo, Citrix Synergy, Cloud Slam, and others. Andy is a co-author of the popular handbook, Visible Ops Private Cloud. He blogs at Andy Mann, UberGeek, and tweets at Andy Mann. At this point, I would like to hand over to Andy. There will be opportunities for questions and answers at the end of Andy's presentation, including a draw to win an iPad. We hope you enjoy the webinar session, and we welcome your feedback also. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Gus. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, one that I'm hearing a lot when I visit with customers and when I talk to other pundits, and it's an important area for your business. DevOps is driven by speed, and this is the world we live in today. In just 60 seconds, 500,000 comments on Facebook, 20 new victims of identity theft, over 200 million emails, 1,500 blog posts, 217 new mobile web users every single minute. This is the sort of pace of the world we're living in. Now, that means that our businesses are demanding innovation. They're demanding us at IT to build new applications, deliver new services, drive new revenue, open up new markets. But typically we see the business's demand for innovation exceeds IT's capacity to deliver that innovation. So there has to be a way to fill that gap. Now, when we talk to our customers, we ask them, what's holding you back? And frequently we hear answers like this: speed, quality, and cost issues are slowing down the software delivery lifecycle. So we see developers spending up to 70% of their time just waiting for resources. Testing systems are not similar, do not replicate the production environment. So when new software goes into production, there are instant problems. But level 1 ops don't know who to escalate to, support are always fighting fires, and meanwhile the line of business is just waiting for this app, waiting for this new service, trying to win their market, but are frustrated that IT can't deliver the apps they need when they need them. Now, part of the problem is that development and operations have this fundamental conflict. Development seems to be tasked with driving fast innovation, rapid change, whereas operations are looking for stability and slow changes. In development, they expect to stream instantly new features into production, where operations want a waterfall release with orderly release timetables spread out over 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. Development want easy access to production data, to production systems, so they can do accurate testing and get those applications out faster without the hassle of going through a difficult security wall. Where operations, they don't want anyone to access production systems because that can cause big problems. Development are looking to deliver agile solutions, whereas operations want to see that project plan and they want to put delivery into the change approval board. Development are being asked by the business to create more and more and more features for internal users and for customers, whereas operations are being asked to maintain stability with a simple system that is easy to operate. So it's no wonder the business execs don't believe that IT can deliver new projects on time and on budget. But there's a solution to this. It's a growing area known as DevOps. And this is all about connecting development and operations together with a collaboration in a single set of objectives. So they're no longer fighting between each other. They're working together to drive stable innovation with predictable, small stream releases, with security that's easy and enables access for development and operations together. Planning is still important, but it's agile, it's fast, it's rapid in small bites. And there's still features, but code release is simple, problems are small and remediated quickly. This is called DevOps. You know, there are lots of definitions, and I'm not going to try and define this to you today, but you know, when you look at things like Wikipedia or GUTS and so forth, you get a common understanding that DevOps is about establishing new methods for improving communication, integration, and collaboration between development and operations. You know, this is not a technology you can buy. This is very much a combination of technology and people and process and methodologies for improving that collaboration between dev and ops. And it works. We have done research. We commissioned independent research with Vance and Bourne. And just recently, we found that the early results of enterprise DevOps are meaningful and significant. A 20% faster time to market for new services, new products, new releases. A 22% improvement in quality of those new releases, which directly translates to things like customer satisfaction. And an 18% reduction in dev and ops costs. These are significant and desirable outcomes. So DevOps works. But especially in larger enterprises, it can be difficult to implement this new method of delivering software. It's very popular in web-scale businesses and businesses that have a reduced number of service offerings. We see DevOps very popular in organizations like Netflix and Zynga and other web-scale businesses. But for large enterprises, it can be very difficult to collaborate because you have complex and dispersed silos with operators and developers spread through multiple data centers and even spread multiple locations around the globe. The product and service complexity in a large organization also hinders that agile service delivery. When you have one small update to a system, in a large enterprise, that can mean retesting on dozens of different systems, services around the globe. And so it's difficult to make that new product or service, to release that new feature, because you don't know where the important portfolio assets are, where your important software assets are, and how they're connected. If you can get agile happening in development, it's really difficult to stream that downstream into operations and into other service areas, into testing, into QA, because a lot of the time in a large enterprise especially, those downstream systems just simply cannot handle the work rate from an agile development process. We've had a lot of time and experience to get agile right in development, but doing it in testing, in QA, in release, in operations, and even more in downstream areas like training, that's not an area we've really managed to make agile yet for large enterprises. And when you've got to, for example, train 25,000 branch users on a new feature, then that can make the agile development very, very difficult to keep up with. Now, with web-scale businesses, and especially some of the new popular technology consumer services, game sites, and other things that use these DevOps methodologies, putting a failed change into production is okay. It's not ideal. You don't want to dissatisfy customers, but because these organizations are putting out small changes and because these organizations are putting out non-mission critical kind of applications. We're talking about watching video or playing games here. We're not talking about hospital records. We're not talking about police records. We're not talking about health insurance or banking ATM systems. It's unacceptable to have any kind of system-wide outage on those systems. Whereas, maybe it's okay if your movie watching system goes down for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, even an hour. But in a large enterprise, failed change is unacceptable because it does cause system-wide outages to mission-critical systems. And then you've got unique security, audit, and compliance roadblocks. In smaller organizations, in organizations that don't have financial or healthcare or other privacy obligations, maybe they don't use credit cards transactions, they don't have to comply with PCS requirements. There's a number of very significant audit and compliance requirements that are unique to large enterprises. And in a lot of cases, this can stop development and operations working effectively together, such as when development want access to production systems to put new code into production. This is not something which is going to happen in a large regulated banking environment, for example. Whereas in an entertainment service, maybe that's okay. Maybe the regulation there is not as big. So you see, for large enterprises, there are, and this is just 5 specific challenges, there are actually a lot of challenges that are unique for the large enterprises to implement this DevOps approach. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. So today I'm going to give you some tips on overcoming these challenges to adopt what I call big DevOps. For large enterprises, big DevOps. So let's talk about how you can adopt DevOps in a large enterprise. So firstly, I mentioned that one of the big enterprise issues is having these complex and dispersed silos where developers, operators are spread over multiple locations in different data centers in different parts of the world. Well, you know what? This is not easy, but to really implement a great DevOps strategy, you need to facilitate this culture of teaming and collaboration. This is actually really important. As I said before, DevOps is not something you buy. DevOps is something you do. So you need to start with culture change that encourages this collaboration, integration, and communication between development and operations. And with smaller web-scale businesses, this has started from the bottom. Individual programmers and developers building out these skills and practices. That's fine when they're located together, when they already communicate, when there may be a smaller organization. In a large organization, you need to bring that executive support. You need to have this top-down initiative and permission to try this new way of working. it's going to require some tough executive decisions. You're going to need to bring things together, and some people won't want to come along. You're going to need to manage the change in environments, in the way people work together, maybe in reporting structures, maybe locations. That is going to be very difficult for you and some of your people, and some of your people won't be able to come along on this journey. And you need to manage this idea of communication and collaboration, especially across different cultures. Different cultures across Europe, across Asia, across South America, and of course across the US mean that the approach to teaming, to bring people together, to consolidating departments, to co-locating teams, that's going to be a significant challenge. But you need to do it. You need to also give those teams permission to try out this new methodology, and in some ways permission to fail at delivery at some of these issues. You certainly need to, if you do fail, make sure you fail fast, fail cheap, and fail small. This is actually one of the big benefits of DevOps and agile development, is being able to try small things quickly and cheaply, and if they don't work, you can fix them fast. You're going to need to connect these teams. Dev and Ops need to work together, and that may mean you need to slim down the teams. You may need to establish new agile teams, especially perhaps for new initiatives. Think about the business demand for new mobile applications, for example, as a really strong place to start from a DevOps perspective. New software developed in new ways, out faster, cheaper, better. And that, as I said, may require co-locating departments like development, testing, quality assurance, and operations. Now, it's important to understand DevOps is not a title. DevOps is not a role. It's not a department. DevOps is a way of delivering software. It's something you do. And so you don't need to create a DevOps department. In fact, that's probably what is known as an anti-pattern for good DevOps. But you do need to co-locate and bring these people together. Sometimes virtual co-location might work. Sometimes you're going to need to actually bring people into the same office. And ultimately, it's about establishing common goals and shared responsibilities between development and operations. For example, we think that developers are responsible for getting code out fast. Well, what about if you make them also responsible for stability in production, on level 1 support, carrying pages, owning their own code past deployment, so they're not just throwing new software over the fence at operations and saying, hey, make this work. And how about making ops accountable for speed, where traditionally they've been accountable for stability and resistant to speed, make them responsible for getting development code out faster. So you're bringing them into that process earlier and removing the incentive for operations to be a roadblock. These are just some of the process tips that I have for overcoming that issue around complexity. There's a lot more to DevOps, and I'll give you some ideas later on about where you can find more information on this topic and more. But meanwhile, my second tip. So in the enterprise, as I said, sometimes it's difficult to know what software updates are important, what goes into production now, what needs to go into a change approval board, what has to go through an exception to change approval. And this can be very difficult, and this definitely slows down agile service delivery, as development and operations are at loggerheads over what's important and what's not. So to get around that in a big enterprise, establish agile software planning as a shared discipline between development and operations, and the business as well, because they need to tell IT what's important. So look at portfolio planning and project planning to identify these high-value opportunities, prioritize them by business metrics, things like performance, market penetration, revenue, and then track these projects. Just because you're doing agile development doesn't mean you don't need to manage projects. Now again, in a large enterprise, this is more true than a smaller enterprise. Smaller businesses and web-scale businesses, I think, are more able to move in agile fashion with a smaller portfolio to understand what improvements, what enhancements to what systems are more important. When you're someone like a web video provider, you're a web game provider, you're able to figure out between your maybe 5, 10, 15 different products which enhancements are more important. If you're a large bank, insurance company, a healthcare provider, and you've got 1,500, 2,000, 10,000 different services, all with hundreds of enhancement requests, how do you know what to apply your agile development practice to? That's the tough part. That's where large enterprises are unique. And so this strategic planning and managing the project through, understanding performance impacts, understanding the strategic allocation of resources, understanding where you are in the project cycle in terms of completion, and the financial impact, for example, of these new services is something that enterprises have to do in different ways. So understanding this portfolio planning opportunity identifies where you're going to make better business by going faster with a DevOps approach. And once you understand what you're going to create, as I said, collaborate on a shared plan. On the top of the screen here, you see a typical waterfall-style delivery cycle. You start with development, doing all the work, getting requirements from the business, building architecture and engineering, doing the Scrum sprint process to develop new code, testing, acceptance, and deployment. Unfortunately, mostly, that's where operations gets brought in. And typically, development systems are not a copy of production systems. You get slowed down. It takes extra weeks, maybe months, for operations to get that software, make it operational, measurable, recoverable, available, stable, secure, and put it into production. But if you have this shared approach to collaboration, this is not a DevOps person, right? These operations and DevOps people working together. So they're working together on requirements. They're working together on architecture, even on development, on testing, on acceptance. So when the software is ready to go into production, operations already know and have provided that critical information to make it operable. So when that delivery deadline comes, the software is in production and stable out of the gate. Now the third thing that I mentioned was about the complex downstream systems. It's one thing to create an agile development team. And they work in isolation, they pump out code, they want to release new things every day. But if your testers are not able to do the testing, if your QA team is not able to do QA, if operations is not able to implement, and if the rest of the business is not able to take on this new capability, then you just get a funnel and an overflowing funnel as the agile team keeps putting more and more and more releases into the funnel, and the rest of those downstream systems can't handle the work rate. So one of the things you can do, and this is really important in a DevOps approach, is to automate relentlessly to enable that rapid response from development and operations. You know, look at things like automated change and configuration. You know, this is substantially to address the problem you hear from developers when they move an application into production and it breaks, and they say, but it worked on my system, and then you hear operations saying, but that doesn't matter, it didn't use a standard build. These sorts of problems slow down release. So imagine if you could take the configuration artifacts from every step of the application delivery lifecycle and feed that into a standardized repository using release automation tools and change and configuration management tools to automatically provision and configure and lodge and approve changes to get that code into production. From dev through to test, through to user acceptance, quality assurance, and into production. You'll be able to deliver applications faster, more efficiently, onto the right environment at the right time, with both developers and operators freed up from waste time on manual configuration and release, and being able to automatically change, configure, provision, and release software into new environments, into existing environments. This is, of course, CA Technologies is, of course, platform and vendor agnostic. There are a lot of tools in this space. But understand that you're connecting these tools together and looking at relentless automation from end to end, not just configuration automation, but all throughout the development, test, accept, and production lifecycle. One area that is often overlooked is test and QA. Now, in a lot of cases, test and QA is a real bottleneck because development pump out code, but testing and QA, and even in development as well, they need the entire environment to do testing. This is another area where this is unique in large enterprises. In a web scale business, maybe you do some simple testing on your Amazon Web Services and your middleware, and that's your entire application. But you know, for a business that is spanning internal and external systems, using some cloud, using some on-premise, using some partner resources, and delivering 1,500, 2,000 different services across mainframes and Unix systems, front and back end, internal, external, it's almost impossible to get an entire system test done because you can't do anything until you have everything. And in IT, in a production style environment, no one ever has everything. So look at automation. How do you automate your testing? How do you automate the environment simulation to be able to test everything at once and do it quickly? So you don't need to rely on change windows. You don't need to rely on weekend testing for mainframe backends. You can test everything in a virtual simulated environment. This is a huge benefit, and we see our customers building out software 20, 30, 50, 100% faster because they're able to test these large-scale infrastructure environments with new code and stream that code rapidly into production. The fourth area I mentioned, in the enterprise, failed changes cause unacceptable system-wide outages, and the knock-on effect of failed change is massive. A small change to one system can damage and cause outages on multiple systems. And as I said, that might be acceptable even for a few minutes if you're a web game developer. That's not acceptable if you're providing people with access to their healthcare data, to their financial systems, to ATM systems, to government services and others. In large enterprises, even small failures can't be tolerated. So, to do big DevOps, stop doing large waterfall releases that cause big problems. Push smaller releases faster, measure those immediately, and remediate any impact quickly. The smaller your releases, the quicker you can get them out, but also the easier and the faster you can remediate, you can find and remediate problems. Obviously, with automated testing, service virtualization of the technologies, you can find more bugs before production, but ultimately, I think we know every software system is going to be liable to have bugs and problems. So make them smaller, find them quicker, fix them faster. One way to do that is with automated and continuous delivery systems, allowing that fast iteration. It's really difficult as a human being to manually release software quickly. But with some of these automation systems, like a continuous delivery system, you can take information from your existing environments, from your existing build and your configuration items. Using application modeling, you can promote and deploy new code into a continuous delivery system and drop that code rapidly into production, whether it's on a new cloud service, on existing infrastructure, on your own data center, and you can get small releases out faster. And you can then iterate. This is a whole new mindset. This is agile for operations as well, so that development and operations now are both on the same timetable, pushing small releases quickly, finding any issues, fixing them quickly, and iterating and repeating that process. Now, it's not enough just to put code into production and say, we're done, we're doing DevOps. You've got to bring operations into that phase. And that means shared monitoring. And I mentioned before the idea of operators actually taking ownership of the development cycle, but also of developers taking ownership of the operation status. So having monitoring that enables developers to see the impact of their code quickly and accurately, exactly where the problem is, looking throughout the end-to-end transaction cycle of a new system or application to figure out, is the problem with my code? Is it in some associated system? Is it in a back-end environment like maybe the mainframe or a database server? And understanding where's that fire coming from, knowing exactly what the problem is, and because you haven't released 50 or 100 new features at once, you know exactly as a developer what you need to fix, and you can do it quickly. This shared monitoring is critical to allow that rapid diagnosis and remediation of problems. And again, in a smaller environment, the systems simply are not that complex. You don't have as many moving parts. In a larger environment, in a big DevOps environment, this becomes even more critical because it's so much more complex in a big bank, and a logistics company, an insurance company, in a government agency. These systems are so much more crusty, they're older, they're legacy, they're complex. And that's unique. Shared monitoring is critical to enable that rapid diagnosis and remediation of problems. And then you need to close the feedback loop. It's not enough to find the problems. It's not even enough to fix the problems. You've got to take that production information and feed it back into the development lifecycle. For example, if you can mine data out of the production world and understand, well, the problem is caused by not having enough capacity. Maybe the problem is caused by a code issue. Maybe the problem is caused because we don't have the right systems, load balancers, middleware in place. Maybe it's caused because we haven't done the right regression testing. So look, go through the application, develop, test, accept, and into production, but then take information again out of the production environment. Understand what it means in terms of constraints. Feed that information back, capacity plans, into regression tests, into virtual service, into configuration, and into ultimately defect plans, which all goes back into the requirement process, into the coding and delivery, integration and acceptance process. This iterative feedback loop helps ensure that when you do have problems, and you will always have problems, you can not only find them and fix them quickly, you can make sure those fixes go back into production and stick in a way that maintains enterprise class compliance and separation of duties, and the other requirements in terms of change control and everything else that large enterprises rely on for stability. And finally, my fifth big DevOps tip. I mentioned that enterprises, big enterprises, face unique challenges when it comes to security, audit, and compliance. In smaller organizations, they might not be subject to things like in the US, the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation that governs only listed organizations, which doesn't cover a lot of smaller web startup scale businesses. Or it might be something like an ISO 27002, which a lot of smaller businesses won't need to comply with because they just simply don't have the complexity to impose that level of process and policy. Or maybe they're not dealing with, for example, the government agencies that require any vendor to have certain certifications. I don't think Netflix, for example, does a lot of business with the Defense Department, whereas large banks, insurance companies, logistics, and others, maybe they do, and they need special kinds of compliance regulations. Even simple things like sharing access to shared user IDs or code on certain systems can be absolutely unacceptable to a big enterprise, where to a smaller, faster, nimble business, that can be less of a problem. But there are ways to use security and identity and access management not as a roadblock, but to enable you to go faster. Not a lot of people think security can be a way to accelerate deployment, but it absolutely can. And in a DevOps world, in a big DevOps world, it has to be. For example, find a way to integrate access to all of your systems, whether on-premise, off-premise, cloud, traditional enterprise applications, whether it's for your own internal developers and operators, or maybe you're using third-party developers, third-party hosting services, maybe even for customer access and partners to work with. Again, in smaller businesses, they often don't have this level of complexity in their secure environment. They maybe don't work that much with partners. Perhaps they don't have a lot of external contractors doing development. It's all in-house. But with larger enterprises, these sorts of identity issues become more and more important. Now, in a lot of smaller businesses, it's going to be okay to have separate user IDs and passwords maybe for your Windows Azure environment than from your internal Oracle environment. Or maybe you don't even have the internal systems as a web scale business, so you only have these integrated cloud environments. Well, with a big enterprise, that doesn't happen. In a big enterprise, you have this complexity. And when you have multiple user IDs and multiple passwords, and you end up sharing user IDs and passwords for things like Amazon or for Windows Azure or Force.com, then you start to get compliance problems, security problems, audit problems, and this is going to slow down or even stop your ability to run quickly with a DevOps approach. But if you can integrate access to all of these on-premise, virtual, and cloud systems, then your developers and your operators can get access to whatever system they need using the core security and identity and access management systems you have in place, whether they're using external cloud, internal systems, whether it's an employee, a contractor, a partner, and it's all through the one system. So you can maintain control, audit, compliance, and yet developers and operations can go fast and work together. And another important area of that is access to those privileged and secure accounts. Now, it's, as I said before, it might be acceptable in some smaller, unregulated business for developers to have access to production code, systems, to be able to do the right level of development and testing at the speed they need to. They might even share user IDs for certain systems. But in larger organizations, typically, those privileged systems are highly protected. With a manual login, it means that every developer gets the most access they need. And there's no real audit or control when you share passwords especially. This is not acceptable in a big enterprise. And I'm not saying it's acceptable in every small business, but in a lot of businesses, a lot of web scale businesses, this is not the same problem that it is for big enterprise. In big enterprise though, we can fix this problem by using, again, automation. And in this time, identity management and privileged user password management through automated security systems. So for example, being able to, as a developer, check in or check out from secure storage the password you need to get into the production Azure system to drop a new code release. It goes through certain approvals, it goes through compliance obligations, it provides control by security over access to these systems, and it provides audit of who's doing what, even to share privileged systems with a least privilege access level. So you only get the access you need, and you only get the access you need when you need it, so that you're able to comply with regulations and other compliance and audit requirements, and yet developers and operations get instant access to the accounts they need to get code into production faster, whether it's on Windows or cloud, whether it's their network appliances, applications, database systems. And so they can go fast, get code into production quickly, even though they're being compliant with these audit and control restrictions. So, just to summarize those 5 tips, and there's so many other ways you need to prepare for DevOps as a big enterprise, but these are 5 ways that I think you can start today by facilitating that culture of learning, of teaming, and collaboration between development and operations. Now, sometimes, as I said, that's going to be difficult, but it's something we have to look at and something you have to do to enable this DevOps approach. You also need to establish that agile planning, shared responsibility, sharing that discipline of agile software planning and delivery between development and operations. And to help maintain that access to those downstream systems, to help everyone keep up with agile development, automate everything you can to enable that rapid DevOps response. And this is more than just configuration automation. Yes, that's important, but you need to automate testing, QA, environment configuration in all environments. You need to automate code release. You need to look at how you automate that ability to respond to problems as well. And it's going to be easier if you push smaller releases faster and measure that impact and remediate that impact faster. Impact of problems will go down. Quality has already gone up because of automation. So you need to understand that this is a whole new approach to releasing software. And that's a big change for big enterprises. And finally, manage those user identities, manage the access so that security becomes a freeway, not a roadblock. So with that, I'm going to turn to the questions, and I have a couple of questions that have come in. And I'll remind you, you can go onto the chat window in the system you're using right now and enter the questions, and I'll try and get to all of them. We've got a couple that come in already. The first one is, in your experience, how do you work with customers to remove that imaginary wall between dev and ops to create that DevOps environment? Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is very much about culture, but it's also about sharing technology and other ways of coming together. As I mentioned, one thing is to co-locate. People work better when they see each other's face. You know, telecommuting is important. It's a great productivity tool. It can save them time and money, but it's really hard to have a stand-up meeting when all your developers are in 5 different locations and 10 different time zones, for example, or the other way around. And let alone if operators are locked in a data center by themselves and they can't be involved in that process. Bring these people physically together and get them working with each other, get them to walk in each other's shoes. You can do this also by doing secondment, so putting some developers into operations for a week, maybe a week a month, maybe a month a year, so they understand what's going on. Putting operators into development, so they learn the basics of coding, of agile development, of that whole agile methodology, and they understand more about what's going on. These are just a couple of ways to break down that imaginary wall. There are lots of different things you'll need to do, and DevOps is as much about changing the culture of how people work together. And as I mentioned, there are also some technology tools that are going to help Dev and Ops come together. Shared tools for project planning, shared tools for agile project management, shared tools for system monitoring, shared tools for code release, for example. Having this shared tool chain that both Dev and Ops are using will help them use the same language, understand the same issues, and work together. So that's just a couple of suggestions. I'll go on to the next question now. Being part of a larger organization, our biggest challenge appears to be getting that cross-team collaboration. We have several tools, but it appears the geographical location and local culture is the big obstacle for us. Look, I see this all the time in my customers. You know, I'm responsible for a worldwide advisory service with my customers. I work on those strategic solutions that cover different departments, that cover the globe. This is a real challenge, and it's not easy to fix. It's not easy to get teams to come together, especially when one team is in India, the other team is in Dallas, and the third team is in Berlin. This is really, really tough. Culture comes into it as well. When you're talking about, in that instance, for example, Indians and Americans and Germans all working together. Language is already an issue. The culture is different too. You know, there are tools that help, but it's not going to help just through tools. You think about, as I said, collaborative tools for planning, teleconference tools, virtual reality tools even, and we're seeing some organizations start to do things with robotic presence and androids and remote locations. Some of these things will help. Nothing beats bringing those teams together. And at CA, we've recently gone through a process where we have closed down offices in certain geographies and co-located people so that we can build in this agile DevOps approach into how we build software. And you know what? It's not easy. It upsets some people, but sometimes that's how business goes, and sometimes these trade-offs have to happen. So look, no silver bullet there. It's a difficult process. Technology will help, but it's really about people. Next question, have you seen big DevOps pay off in a setup that spans 3 to 4 geographical regions? You know what? I actually have. A couple of large banks I work with, global operations, have been able to implement DevOps type approaches. Now this is another thing about large enterprises. Maybe you can't do the whole end-to-end DevOps. Maybe you can't use DevOps for every application or service. So you know what? That doesn't mean you can't use it at all. You should look at maybe starting DevOps with just 1 or 2 of your service environments, where the geography is not so broad that it makes it too hard. So maybe across the geographical regions in Europe, and you can use DevOps teams that can come together over teleconferencing. They can do stand-up meetings together, even if it's just virtual. Operations and development can talk together because they have shared common experience, and they're within a time zone that only spans 3 or 4 hours. You know, if you're going to try and do DevOps across a 12-hour time zone, across geographies, across the other side of the world, that's going to be harder. But you know, large banks, I've seen also logistics companies, cell phone wireless companies, doing DevOps in stages. Maybe it's just in development QA into production, and they're getting part of it faster. Maybe they're automating configuration, provisioning, and code release to be able to keep up with the agile developers. You know, these are the sorts of approaches big DevOps will need to take, stepwise approaches to that agile development and operations toolchain. Next question, and thanks for all these questions. Again, I remind you, please stay until the end, add your own questions, and we'll be drawing that iPad giveaway. That's pretty cool. The next question I had, the major challenge I see is a cultural one, with everyone being accountable and responsible for delivery end-to-end. Absolutely. Look, I've spoken a lot about tools, but I've also mentioned culture. Make sure that you don't think DevOps is about tools and technologies. They help, but you've got to change the culture. You've got to do it top down. Okay. Where are we? Next question. You mentioned about environmental differences in larger companies. We're then talking about more about hybrid cloud, you know, internal hosting, external cloud, local desktops. This is not possible to have full consistency between environments. Do you have any suggestions on approaching these gaps? This is a huge problem. Developers have one system that they develop and test on. Architects have a different system that they try their prototype out on. QA and test have even different systems that they do testing on. And ultimately, when it gets into production, they have different systems as well. It's like these systems are never fully tested. No wonder it's slow. No wonder we get bugs and downtime. That's where you need to simulate those environments and replicate them exactly in virtual services from not just servers, but the whole virtual environment, servers, applications, middleware, load cycles, storage, networks, simulate and virtualize those services end to end. Now, CA Technologies obviously has the CA Lisa suite of products that's going to help do that, but this is a critical part of DevOps, is having the identical systems in every stage so that you don't find these problems at the end when you deploy. Where are we? This is a great tip. Well, thank you very much. Should we also have teams owning the on-call aspect, a way to give them ownership and responsibility? I would say absolutely. This is part of responsibility and accountability throughout the life cycle. Make developers responsible and accountable by putting them on call when their code is in production. This is what big web-scale businesses do when they do DevOps. There's no reason why large enterprises can't either. Big enterprises, after all, you know, we've been having developers on call for a long time. This shouldn't be a shock to them. Testing. In some of our legacy applications, we have about 60% automated test coverage. You know what? That's not bad. We think this should be at 90%. However, what is an average percentage you see in your customers that claims success? You know, no one's ever going to get to 100% automated testing. But this is a very important part of the DevOps approach, is building applications in order to be tested. So building them with tests in mind. Create the testing, the framework for testing new features and capabilities before developing those capabilities so that you know exactly what your goal is. You know, when you create the testing methodology after you've already built the development, it's probably too late. You don't necessarily know everything that's going on in that application, that system. So this is very important, building that out, that test environment before you start even developing and understanding. And also creating those replicated, simulated virtual environments that are, you know, a simulation or a virtual service that looks exactly like production. Okay, what have we got now? A lot of questions, great stuff. If I don't get through them all today, and it doesn't look like I will, We'll get back to you individually with some answers. So don't worry, we'll get to you eventually. It might just not be in the webinar today. Look, I think I'll take a final question. We're just about at the end of our time. Does a DevOps environment prefer generalists or specialists to succeed? That's a really interesting question. Look, I've seen it work with both. With large enterprises especially, you tend to work better with specialists. Smaller environments, a generalist, they can take on more. There's less complexity, there are fewer products, there are fewer technologies involved. But you know what, in large enterprises, you might have 4 different automation systems doing the same thing. You might have 3 different middleware systems. You might be running 5 different databases. It's hard for a generalist to work that out. So where in the smaller organizations we see people still specializing. Like I said, there is no DevOps role. You still have developers who have specializations and operators who have specialization. But in big enterprises with big DevOps, it's going to be the case that you need those specialists to really understand the details. How does my NoSQL database, my MySQL database work? How does Hadoop work? How does the Oracle instance work? These are different specializations, even in themselves for a large enterprise. So it's going to be about large organizations. Hey, look, thank you so much, everyone, for all of these questions. I don't have time for them all, but we'll get back to you. I just want to reiterate the summary here before we wrap up. Don't forget, we'll be giving our own iPad in just a second. Very cool. But when you want to respond to these big enterprise challenges, you want to get big DevOps approaches. Facilitate teaming, enable that agile planning as a shared discipline, automating relentlessly, enabling that rapid DevOps response. And just before we go, what are you going to be able to do next? Well, start by reviewing how are you doing it today. How are your teams collaborating today? Are they even collaborating? How often? In what way? If they're not, you've probably already got a problem. Even if they are, you probably can make it better. Make improvements intentionally. So that means hard decisions. Explore automation in that software development lifecycle wherever possible. Accelerate throughput, remove human errors, get fast, get safe, and get small. Be able to do these improvements quickly, remediate quickly. And enable agile by removing the delays in software development lifecycle, where development and test and QA can't get access to things like mainframes or Unix systems or other back-end. Let them do it in virtual ways. And obviously, CA technologies can help. If you'd like to know more, please email justin.vbrown@ca.com. And we'll send you our CTO's booklet on how to get started with DevOps. Now, that's all from me. At this point, I'd like to outsource. I'd like to hand over. I've been in IT too long, haven't I? I'd like to hand over to our hosts to give away that iPad. Thank you very much for your time. Remember, email Justin to get a copy of that booklet. So tell us, Gus, who's the lucky winner of the iPad?
Thanks, Andy. That concludes the question and answer session, as well as the presentation. The winner for the draw is Christy Ross. So we'll be in touch shortly, Christy. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar. We'll make the recording available afterwards, and we'll send you the link as well. We look forward to your participation at a future DevOps event. Thank you.